I'm Mike McDermott, and in today's video we're going to look at the first two campaigns that occurred during the Mexican War after those northern battles had been completed. The first was the occupation of the port city of Vera, Cruz, and then the first battle to start the march across the mountains to the capital of Mexico City. The Battle of Vera Cruz began on the 9th of March, 1847, with the first large amphibious assault ever conducted by American troops across an enemy's beach. The campaign ended successfully 20 days later with the occupation of the city of Vera Cruz. President James K. Polk, for political reasons, initially wanted Senator Thomas Hart Benton to command the operation. The senator was completely inexperienced with military affairs, and after much discussion, and I can imagine much spirited argument, General Winfield Scott, the commanding general of the Army, was given the mission. A veteran of the War of 1812 and a meticulous planner and organizer, General Scott was charged with establishing a base at the port city of Vera Cruz to support an overland advance which would culminate in the attack on Mexico City. Once the Mexican capital was occupied, President Polk was sure the enemy would negotiate a peace treaty on American terms, and ultimately that's what occurred. General Taylor's force in northern Mexico therefore became an army of occupation when he was ordered to provide troops to support General Scott's operations farther south. Seizing Vera Cruz was a momentous task. The city was protected by three major strong points. The first of those features was a massive fortress which mounted 135 guns and was garrisoned by about 1,000 men. It was built on an offshore reef, was difficult to approach, and blocked any direct attack from the sea. And in fact, General Scott chose to ignore it. The other two large and well-constructed forts, one at each end of a formidable defensive wall, blocked any attack from the city's land side. Those two forts were manned by 3,360 soldiers and supported by about 100 cannon. The Mexican commander was unsure if he could actually hold the city because of a shortage of powder. He also discovered that portions of that defensive wall had fallen into disrepair. It was too late to make the proper corrections. The American force was assembled offshore on the 5th of March, and the following day, General Scott and his senior commanders, Commodore David Connor, commanding the flotilla, and Generals William Worth, David Twiggs, and Robert Patterson, conducted a reconnaissance of the proposed landing site. Staff officers who accompanied them included Captain Robert E. Lee, Joseph E. Johnston, and Lieutenants Pierre Beauregard and George Meade, all names that became very familiar during the American Civil War. The landing site selected was a quiet stretch of water located about 3 miles southeast of Vera Cruz, which gave the Americans an unobstructed approach to that city wall. The first of General Scott's three divisions went ashore unopposed the afternoon of the 9th of March, and before the day was over, the rest of the 8,600 soldiers in the command had successfully crossed the beach and were ashore. By 13 March, the Americans had closed up to the wall and completely enveloped the city. Despite several sharp fights with Mexican forces who attempted to disrupt that process, the siege lines were in place. An American assault may have been able to overwhelm the defenders and occupy Vera Cruz, but the risk of heavy casualties would have crippled the army and brought into question its very ability to move on to Mexico City. On the 22nd of March, General Scott, who was very concerned about the approaching yellow fever season, called on on the Mexican commander to surrender, and his refusal signaled the opening of an American bombardment, which was brutal. Supplementing his artillery by bringing guns ashore from the fleet, General Scott opened a sustained shelling of Vera Cruz and the fortifications. Over a 4-day period, 6,700 rounds shattered the city's defenses and drove the 15,000 civilians in the city underground. Initially, the Mexican guns responded in kind, as recorded by an American artillery officer who wrote, "I wish you could hear one of those huge projectiles in the air as they are coming. The roar they make may be compared to that of a tornado, and every man within a quarter mile of the spot where they strike thinks that they are about to fall on his own individual head. The consequences is that there is a great scampering to and fro." Having been under artillery fire, I can appreciate, and particularly if they're just in sand and they're unable to get very far underground, it's a terrifying experience. The shelling stopped when General Morales began negotiating a surrender, and with his capitulation, the American flag was raised over the city on the 29th of March. Mexican casualties were estimated at 100 civilians and 80 soldiers killed, while the Americans suffered 19 killed and 55 men wounded. With Vera Cruz secured as his supply base, General Scott turned his attention to moving on to Mexico City, and he chose the route taken by Cortez in 1519. General Scott's earlier letter to General Taylor requesting the transfer of men to augment his force had been particularly sensitive due to old Rough and Ready's volcanic temper. And General Scott wrote, "I shall be obliged to take from you most of the gallant officers and men, regulars and volunteers, whom you have so long and so nobly commanded. I am afraid that I shall reduce you for a time to stand on the defense. This will be infinitely painful to you, and for that reason distressing to me also. But I rely on your patriotism to submit to the temporary sacrifice with cheerfulness." Well, General Taylor was not cheerful about it, and he complied slowly and with ill grace, compounding the problems that General Scott had building his force. Lieutenant Dabney Maury recorded his impression of the beach assault, and he wrote, "The landing was made in whaleboats, rowed by sailors of the fleet. In each boat were 50 to 60 soldiers, and it was a glorious sight to see that 50 great barge line approaching the beach." In addition to the hazards of enemy fire, one officer was particularly impressed with Mexican insects, and he wrote home, "I have never seen anything like these Vera Cruz fleas. If one were to stand 10 minutes in the sand, the fleas would open up on him in the hundreds. How they live in that dry sand, no one knows." The engineer officers, G.W. Smith and McClellan, slept in canvas bags drawn tight about their necks, having previously greased themselves in salt pork. It seems that even those innovative efforts have very little effect on the persistent sand fleas of Mexico. And now it's time for the Army to move on. The Battle of Cerro Gordo was the first fight that General Scott's troops encountered as they left Veracruz and began to cross the mountains into central Mexico. But before we look at that particular battle, it's necessary to do a little update on the enemy's forces. How that Mexican army that had fought up north was reconstituted and redeployed. Following the battle near the Hacienda San Juan de la Buena Vista in northern Mexico, General Santa Anna returned to Mexico City with the majority of that army and seized control of the government in Mexico City. After securing a large loan from the Catholic Church, he put a trusted subordinate in charge of the capital and formed an army of the East to confront General Scott's forces, who were being closely monitored at Vera Cruz. Recognizing the 12,000 soldiers he commanded were largely untrained, and 5,600 of them were exhausted from their month-long 1,000-mile march south from Buena Vista, General Santa Anna chose to defend against an American attack rather than attempting to engage General Scott's army in open battle. The mountain pass at Cerro Gordo was an ideal location for his purpose, as the national road linking Vera Cruz and Mexico City followed a narrow, mile-long ravine through the pass that was hemmed in by cliffs dominated by high ground. The Mexicans established a strong position centered on El Telegrafo, a steep hill rising 600 feet to the north side of the road. Artillery batteries with infantry support were located on nearby hilltops and also employed to cover the road. Putting great trust in his preparations to defend the capital, General Santa Anna sent an optimistic report to Mexico City while waiting for the American army to appear. His message turned out to be overconfident, in part because of the morale of the officers and soldiers in his army. Poorly trained and short on food and water, many doubted their ability to stop the Americans, and psychologically, they were looking to the rear and they were ready to run. Meanwhile, General Scott, fearful that the approaching yellow fever season would catch his army on the coast, had troops marching west in blazing hot weather 3 days after occupying Vera Cruz. On the 12th of April, the lead American division, 2,600 strong and commanded by General David Twiggs, located and probed the Mexican positions at Cerro Gordo. General Twiggs held to a single tactical concept, which was the no-nonsense, head-on attack. And he decided to launch what was sure to be an extremely costly assault. His plan was fortuitously canceled at the very last moment, however, by General Robert Patterson, who commanded the follow-on division and was his senior in rank. 2 days later, General Scott arrived and ordered the topographical engineers to conduct a thorough reconnaissance of the battlefield. Lieutenant Pierre Beauregard realized if a prominent hill could be seized, the Mexican position might be outflanked. Captain Robert E. Lee was able to locate a primitive trail bypassing the Mexicans' left flank, and on the 16th of April, engineers improved the trail sufficiently to move both artillery and troops. The following day, General Twiggs' division advanced along the trail and seized that prominent hill, which was adjacent to the critically important El Telegrafo. Lieutenant Grant later recorded in his personal memoirs, under the supervision of the engineers, roadways had been opened over chasms to the right where the walls were so steep that men could hardly climb. Animals could not. These had been opened under cover of night without attracting the notice of the enemy. The engineers, who had directed the opening, then led the way and the troops followed. Artillery was let down the slopes by hand, by attaching a strong rope to the rear axle and letting the guns down a piece at a time. In like manner, the guns were drawn by hand up the opposite slope. On the morning of 18 April, El Telegrafo, key to the Mexican defense, was attacked from both front and flank and quickly overrun. The Americans also seized the road behind General Santa Anna's defenses, and the Mexican army disintegrated when their camps had been captured. General Santa Anna fled, leaving a baggage wagon with his personal papers and a strong box containing $20,000 in gold coin. American casualties totaled 63 men killed and 368 wounded. So it was a difficult fight. While the Mexican losses were not recorded, although 3,000 men had been taken prisoner. The American army continued moving west on the National Road and occupied Pueblo, a city of 80,000 people located in a rich agricultural region, by the 15th of May. The following month, 7 regiments of one-year volunteers began their march back to Vera, Cruz and home, leaving General Scott with only 7,100 men in his army. Considering the increased problems with Mexican guerrillas on the National Road and the plentiful provisions available in Puebla, General Scott pulled all his troops in that had been protecting his main line of communications and effectively cut himself off from Veracruz. By August, after a period of rest and recovery and with reinforcements joining the army, General Scott was prepared to get back on the road to Mexico City. His objective was to march 100 miles through enemy-held territory, defeat an army 3 times the size of the American force, and capture a fortified city of 200,000 people. Captain Lee had made his mark when he located and worked to improve that trail around the Mexican flank at Cerro Gordo. And General Scott, who later promoted Captain Lee to the rank of brevet major, wrote, quote, "I am impelled to make special mention of the services of Captain R.E. Lee, engineers. This officer, greatly distinguished at the Siege of Veracruz, was again indefatigable during these operations in reconnaissance, as daring as laborious, and of the utmost value," end quote. Major Lee's experience during the battle was transformative for him personally. After years of peacetime assignments as a military engineer, he had finally taken part in a desperate fight, and the physical and emotional costs affected him deeply. Several days after the battle, he wrote his son Curtis, who was then 15 years old. And in part, the letter says, "The papers cannot tell you what a horrible sight a field of battle is, nor will I. My personal friend, Joe Johnson, was wounded. He was wounded in the arm and in the groin, but the bullets are out, and he was doing well and was quite comfortable when I last saw him. Captain Mason of the Rifles was badly wounded in the leg. General Shields wounded in the chest. You have no idea what a horrible sight a battlefield is." And with that, the army was ready to move on to Mexico City. And thus ends the battle at Cerro Gordo, and the next video will describe the follow-on actions en route to Mexico City. And until then, thank you for watching, and God bless America.